You're listening to the Youth for Life podcast with Michelle Baum, Director of Why for Life at Lutherans For Life, where we prepare youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording of our Chats for Life program to find out how you can be live too on our next Youth for Life podcast. All right, Pastor Salemink. I think most of you have met him before, yes? I think so. If you want to just reintroduce yourself. Sorry, I was talking over you.
That's okay. I'm Pastor Salemink. Good evening. That's my introduction. But I do want to put a different image before you. When you think of overpopulation, I want you to imagine a field full of flowers. So many flowers, far as the eye can see. Mother Teresa once said, "How can there be too many children?" That's like saying there are too many flowers. When we think about overpopulation, too many human beings is not really a problem. The real problem is too many human beings and not enough space, not enough food, not enough money. So the question we have to ask is not, are there too many people, but is there enough of what people need to survive? The idea of the world being overpopulated is actually very, very old. Even before the book of Genesis was written. So even before Moses and the Israelites left Egypt, there were other myths, stories of how the world was created, right? Other than the true one, which had been passed down from Adam to his children and their descendants all the way to Moses, until Moses wrote it down in the book of Genesis. And one of those ancient myths, those other competing fairy tales about how the earth was created, comes from what we call the ancient Near East. So around the same area that the Israelites lived, Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon. And this story, interestingly enough, has a lot of similarities to the book of Genesis. It includes a creator God. It includes everything coming into being out of nothing. It even includes the story of a worldwide flood. And that's not actually surprising to us as Christians, because we believe that what Moses tells us went on in the book of Genesis actually happened. And so even cultures that didn't believe in God, the Father of Jesus Christ, as God, still would have had this memory, this sort of cultural memory of things that had been passed down from generation to generation of actual historical events. So it's not a surprise to us that there are similarities to the book of Genesis, but the most famous of these ancient myths, it's called the Enuma Elish, and it's Babylonian, and it actually tells how after the main God created human beings, he got annoyed with them because they were too noisy and they were too dirty. And so he came up with a plan to actually get rid of most of the human beings and encourage the human beings who did exist to have fewer children. So that was kind of the foundational creation story of an entire culture for thousands of years. So the idea that the world has too many people or that we should have fewer people goes back that far. The modern idea of fear of overpopulation actually comes to us beginning about the start of the 19th century. In 1798, there was an Anglican pastor by the name of Thomas Malthus, Malthus. And so sometimes you will hear overpopulation referred to as Malthusianism, right? The belief that the earth has too many people. And this Reverend Thomas Malthus, he thought that human populations increase geometrically, right? That means if two people have a child, then or if two people have two children, then each of those two children have two children of their own. Then each of those four children have two children of their own. It increases very fast. And so he observed that if that's how it works with human population, then the food supply only increases mathematically rather than geometrically or exponentially, right? So he deduced that eventually, and his fear was that it was going to be pretty soon, there were going to be people having babies so fast that the food supply would not be able to keep up with them. And that was the beginning of at least the Western world's fear about overpopulation. Obviously, that never happened. It never came to pass. But the idea sort of came back into popularity in 1968. And it comes from a professor at Stanford University named Paul Ehrlich. And he was a biologist. And so he looked around at the data on world populations and birth rates and how fast people were having babies. And he predicted the same thing. He said, food supply is going to run out. We're going to have mass starvations. By the 1990s, the world's going to be a desolate wasteland because all of humankind will have died out. Naturally, of course, it is now 30 years past 1990, and the world is nowhere near what he predicted coming to pass. So twice in Western history, there's been this gigantic fear of overpopulation that hasn't happened. And even though it hasn't happened, that doesn't stop many people of our time and our culture from being afraid that there are too many people in the world. Some of you are familiar with England's royal family, right? Queen Elizabeth, she's been around so long that when God said, let there be light, she flipped the switch. But she has these two grandsons who are like princes, right? And you know who they are. I don't remember their names. There's one who's a good prince and one that's kind of a bad prince, right? And I think the good prince is the older guy and his wife is a nice lady. And the bad prince is a younger guy and his wife is not a nice lady.
William and Harry.
Yes. Which one's the good guy?
William.
William is the older one, right? Okay. So he's the respectable guy. Anyway, he and his wife, I think today they have 3 children. When they conceived their second child, an environmentalist group from Canada wrote an open letter to them they published in the news, begging them not to have any more children because the earth already has too many people and more kids are bad for the environment. So this idea is still very popular today. As a matter of fact, it's so popular that in 1980, the nation of China looked around at their country and said, in a few years, we think we're going to have too many people. So they instituted a ban on having more than one child. It's called China's one-child policy. And it was enforced by fines. So if you got caught having more than one child, you could be fined a lot of money. If you couldn't pay the fine, sometimes they would force women to have their children aborted. Or they would force a woman to be sterilized so that she couldn't have any more children. That policy worked. And so today, China is actually dealing with the opposite problem. They don't have enough children. Thanks to advances in medicine and technology, human beings are living longer now than they have ever lived in the history of the world on average. So what you have in China is this growing population of older people who, as happens with older people, reach an age where they're not capable of doing manual labor anymore. And that manual labor is important to keep a country running. Yet they don't have enough children to replace the jobs that are needed to do those sorts of things. And they don't have enough kids to take care of the aging population. The truth is that population data actually show us that while world population has been growing since the beginning of time, it's probably going to reach its highest level around the year 2060. That's only 40 years away. And they're predicting that, these are unbiased scientists, people who work for the United Nations. Not that everybody who works for the United Nations is unbiased, but these people are certainly not biased in favor of underpopulation. If anything, they'd be biased in favor of seeing the world as overpopulated. But looking at their calculations, based on the current birth rates of all the countries in the world, they are predicting that around the year 2060, there will be 9 billion people living at the same time on Earth. And at that point, the number will start to go down. That's troubling because once that number starts to go down, it's very difficult to make it go back up again. Once people start having fewer kids, which has already happened, it's very difficult then for people to start having enough more kids to make up for the fewer kids that the generation before them had. Many countries, including the United States, have more people die every year than are being born. And here's a couple numbers you'll need to remember. One is called the replacement rate. The replacement rate is 2.1 children per woman. That's how many children each woman would need to have on average in order to keep the population of the country exactly the same. Now, it's obvious that no woman can have 2.1 children. She could have 2 children, but then it's either 3 or no more. Nobody can give birth to 0.1 children. It's just an average. And the reason why it's 2.1 is that every woman needs to give birth to 1 child to replace herself, another child to replace her husband, who can't have any children of his own, and then 0.1 on average of a child to make up for all the other women who don't or can't have any children. The fertility rate, or the birth rate in the United States today, is 1.9 children per woman. That's below replacement rate. In some places like Japan, the birth rate is 1.6 children per woman. And that's a crisis. In fact, it's so bad. I actually have that statistic wrong right in front of me. It says in Japan, it's 1.2 children, so even lower. Some countries in Europe have started giving money to couples who have more children. Russia, Poland, Denmark. They will actually give you a government subsidy to help you pay for your child because they know that they're in a crisis and we need more people. Now, we said in the beginning that overpopulation isn't the problem for 2 reasons. Number one, overpopulation isn't a problem because the world doesn't have too many people. Okay. Secondly, the real problem is not overpopulation, but sufficient amount of resources. Well, here's some statistics, some research that shows that the world could support a lot more people. The United Nations estimates that there's currently enough food being grown and produced in the world to comfortably feed 10 billion people. That's if we never grow any more food than we are right now. So if we don't plant more fields, if we don't develop new technologies that make those fields yield even more, the current food production levels could sustain 10 billion people. What about water? In the last 100 years, the availability of fresh water has gone up 7 times over. In the last 100 years, world population has only increased 4 times over. If we estimate how much land is available for people to live on, if we just divided up all of the land in the world between all of the people who currently live in the world, every person could have 5 acres of their own land. Maybe you think to yourself, yeah, but maybe that land would be wasteland. No, 1/10 of it, a whole half acre, would be usable for farming. A half acre is about the size of a city house lot. So if you live in town, about the size of your house, or if you have a small lot, it would be twice that. You could plant a garden. Easily that would grow enough food for you and your family and lots of other people. If all we needed was a place to live, we could all fit, everybody in the world could fit in Texas. There'd be enough room for everybody to have a house. If all we needed was a place to sleep, we could all fit into Connecticut, and the rest of the world would be wide open. So there's plenty of food, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of land. What's the problem? People are still going hungry. People are still going homeless. But hunger and homelessness have been problems since a long time before anybody was complaining about overpopulation. They are problems. That is true, and as Christians, we definitely want to address those problems. But getting rid of people is actually the worst thing we could do to solve those problems. In the past, whenever cultures, communities, societies have successfully addressed problems like poverty and homelessness and hunger, they have done so by people working together, right? The old proverb is true: 2 heads are better than 1, and 3 heads are better than 2. And the more the merrier, because the more minds you have working on solving a problem, the quicker we're going to get to a solution, and the better the solution is going to be. Sometimes we need the wealthiest members of a population to recognize that they have more than they need, and so they can share some of that extra with people who don't have enough. But the problem is not that we lack the resources. The problem is accessibility. How do people get those resources? So if we're genuinely worried about too many people going hungry, the solution is not, well, let's just have fewer people. The solution is, let him who has 2 tunics share with him who has none, as Jesus instructs us. Furthermore, devoting money to controlling the population, like China has done, funding officials and surveys and policing to keep people from having more children, that takes money away from what could be invested in making sure that everybody has a home and enough to eat and clothes to wear. So, overpopulation is sometimes used as the justification for abortion. Why should we bring another child into an already overpopulated world where that additional child is just going to place a strain on the resources that are already stretched too thin? In reality, that child is going to contribute to helping distribute those resources in a way that everybody has what they need. But I want to ask, if you believe that abortion, killing children before they are born, is the solution to overpopulation, would you be willing to pay people not to have children? Would you be willing to forbid someone from having a child? Would you be willing to force them, as China has done, to kill children that are conceived outside of the law? And if all of that doesn't work, and you still believe that killing children is the answer to overpopulation, would you then be okay with starting to execute children who have already been born? And which ones? You see, we would never say that this is a viable solution for any other problem. And remember, the problem is not overpopulation. The problem is poverty. So, is it okay to execute homeless people? I mean, if we execute enough homeless people, there won't be any more homelessness. I think most folks would not be comfortable purchasing their comfort with the blood of innocent human beings. I think most folks would not want to live in a world where we solve our problems by killing the people who complain. From God's perspective, more people means more blessings, right? What did God say in the beginning? He said to the man and the woman, be fruitful and multiply. Multiply until you what? Fill the earth and subdue it. And then in the Psalms, he says children are a gift from the Lord. That means every child is a gift. That means every additional child is an additional gift. As a matter of fact, the psalmist goes on to say, blessed is the one who fills his quiver with them, with children. What the heck is a quiver? Well, it's that sort of special backpack that archers have to hold their arrows. Now, how many arrows are enough to fill a quiver? Well, I suppose that depends on what you're going to use the arrows for. Typically, folks use arrows for either hunting or fighting. In either case, the more arrows you have, the better off you are, which is exactly what the scriptures are saying. Remember the promise, the blessing that God gave to Abraham that made him the patriarch of the nation of Israel, perhaps the most blessed man in the history of all of God's people. God said, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore. Just to compare, scientists have estimated that Earth contains more than 7 quintillion grains of sand. That's like a trillion times a billion. Scientists also estimate that our galaxy by itself, which is only one of innumerable observable galaxies, our galaxy contains 100 billion stars. Either way, it seems like God was not concerned about there being too many children on earth. And why is that? Because the one who said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, who said, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the seashore. He is also the one who said, I own the cattle on 1,000 hillsides. He is the one who says, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And are you not of much more value than they are. So God knows what his people need, and he has several tricks up his sleeve. First, he who did not spare his own son but gave him up for us all will also with him graciously give us all things. And if we should ever find ourselves in a situation where we don't have enough to eat or enough to wear or a place to sleep, God has shown that he is ready, willing, and able to miraculously multiply stuff out of thin air. Think of how Jesus fed 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So for Christians, too many people is impossible. That's like saying there are too many flowers. Each additional person is not only a neighbor, but a blessing from God and a co-worker in caring for the people around us who are in need. Unlike the unbelieving world around us, we do not see our neighbors as enemies or competitors or burdens. We see them as gifts and privileges from God. And anyways, all the science shows that not only do we not have too many people, but very soon we might find ourselves with not enough people. Is that a good place to stop, Mrs. Bauman, and do some Q&A and some reflection?
Sure. What do you guys think? How many of you have heard of that argument for abortion? There's too many people already. So a lot of us have already heard that as an argument. So let's say that that happens in a classroom, right? And someone says that, or maybe, you're walking down the hall. What could you say in response? Pastor Salemink has given us lots of ideas of things to say, but let's say we don't have 45 minutes. What are some of the things that we could say in response?
Well, first I would probably ask and see where they're coming from, as in, like, what makes you think there's too many people? Like, let's not even get to abortion as the solution. We don't need to talk about a solution yet. We need to find, what is the problem? What makes you think there are too many people? And if your answer is, well, you have people living on the streets and people who are poor, and it's like, well, then is the problem that there's too many of them, or is the problem that there's not enough resources for them, or they're not getting resources? Kind of like what Pastor Salemink said. Don't just jump the gun and assume abortion's going to solve homelessness, if that's what you're talking about, because it won't. That's not what the problem is.
So asking the question, why do you think that? That's a great way to start. Great place to start. Why do you think overpopulation might be a problem? Good. What else?
And let me add, your thinking is so smart that it applies in other situations as well, because abortion is often used as a potential solution to all kinds of problems, right? We say, well, we need to have abortion available because some children are born and they're abused. Or we need to have abortion available because women are not treated equally to men. Or we need to have abortion available because sometimes a woman, that will interrupt her career path. And the logic is the same, right? Asking the question, what makes you think those things are a problem? And if so, are there better solutions?
What about resources? Can you jump right to resources? Can you talk about that? Very often, that is the crux behind overpopulation, comments on overpopulation, right? We just don't have enough water. We just don't have enough food. So what could you do? Any facts that stood out from tonight that you think, that's a good fact? I could share that.
I think just the actual availability of all of these resources, that I think just the distribution of them is what needs to be fixed, rather than the amount of resources themselves, even if that's an argument, we don't have enough resources, because obviously we do. It's just who's getting them and everything. So,
and I put some links in the chat box to some of those statistics and resources, so you can check those out, and it links to the authorities and the organizations, some of that I mentioned, so that you can have sources when you're talking about.
Thank you. What other things? I know, Christian, you had unmuted yourself. Did you have something?
Well, Ellie kind of covered it. I was going to comment more specifically on the Connecticut and Texas things where you could fit everybody in there, but Ellie kind of covered that with her distribution of resources comment, and I figured, well, land is a resource, and the way it's distributed is also a point of contention sometimes.
Sure. One of the things, I spent a lot of time in Nebraska, both growing up and going to college. And in Nebraska, there's actually, I mean, we produce so much corn that in Nebraska they make, and in other states, obviously, they make gasoline out of that corn. And in Nebraska, you can get that gasoline cheaper than you would regular gasoline. So again, the idea that we don't have enough food actually doesn't hold true in on so many levels and in so many instances. There's an overabundance of it, especially in America.
Well, if the question is, if you meet someone who thinks that resources are a problem, you're probably not going to be able to convince them just by telling them, no, you're wrong, there's actually a lot of resources. They're going to be like, well, how do you know? And it might be helpful to invite them to do some research with you and like figure out and let them find the facts for themselves. Like, why don't you find some good websites and why don't you look into it and see where these resources actually are? Like, you don't look like you're in a position where you're going to believe me telling you like facts are facts because you don't agree with me already anyway. Like, come on, let's try to figure this out together.
Sure. Good. Great ideas. Ultimately, at the crux of that overpopulation idea, we have an issue with life, right? It is, why is this something that we're talking about at a Y for Life, Chats for Life? What do you guys think? How does this affect how we view life and how we respond to life? This idea that overpopulation is a real problem.
Well, I mean, the concern for overpopulation kind of views life, like human life, as a problem and a bad thing and something that they don't want. And we need to remember that, like, God created human lives and they're precious, and we need to like take care of them, but we shouldn't be trying to like eliminate them.
Good. Pastor Duncan.
I'm curious because one of the issues that is so prevalent, especially in this election cycle and has been for the last decade, is climate control. And often climate control gets rolled into the population question. Too many people causing too many effects on the climate. And so unless we bring the population under control or the ways that these populations interact with each other, we're going to destroy the planet as well. And you see this on major scales, even today, the United Nations adopting an Agenda 2030, which has one of its primary tenets, climate control, in addition to eliminating poverty and all the other neat things that they roll into it. I'm curious about how we can talk about that, because I think this is one of the reasons that population control is important for us to get a handle on this, because it rolls into so many other factors that we have to talk.
But there's several different points to be made in regard to that. Number one, at the basic level, the logic is the same. If human beings are the problem, and the only solution to catastrophic climate change is fewer human beings, then why is it only okay to execute unborn human beings? Why couldn't we start, for example, with you? Since you care so much about the climate, would you be willing to sacrifice your life for a better future? But I contend that if climate change really is a human-caused problem, then the solution will require all of us working together. And the more of us we can get working on the problem, the better. But I do not grant, A, that climate change is a problem, or B, that humankind is the cause of it. you do need to know that the science about those 2 points is still very much in flux and under dispute. And as a third point, the past several months when many folks in the world have been quarantined, limited to their homes because of the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen improvements in air quality, right? A reduction of air pollution in some of the places in the world where it has been very bad. And that suggests that we don't necessarily need to get rid of human beings in order to rectify this problem if it is in fact a problem. But that discussion is, I mean, there's a lot of competing perspectives, but we do need to remember that these things are never just science, they're ideology. And there's a certain ideology associated with climate change alarmism. And it's the same kind of ideology that's associated with overpopulation alarmism. And at its core, this ideology does not view human life as sacred. So that's going to be a point of departure for us. Now, there's common ground. It's always a good place to start by affirming the common ground with somebody. And so if someone comes to you and says, we need to have abortion be legal because climate change is a real problem, you can say, I'm so glad that you are concerned for the well-being of nature and the environment, because as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why I believe God placed human beings in this world was to make use of it and care for it. And so I believe we have an obligation and a responsibility to care for it too. Now I want to explore with you what might be the best ways to do that. And then we can have a conversation about those things.
All right.
This is going back a little bit to the question you asked. Why is the question of overpopulation so important to the For Life position? And I think a part of it is that if you view overpopulation as a problem and the solution as we need to get rid of more people, then you're viewing human life as valuable only if you can take care of it. Like, only if we have enough food for you do you matter. Only if we have enough only if we have a place for you to live do you matter. And it's like, so the worth of the human becomes dependent on whether we're able to provide for them. Is there nothing intrinsic to being a human that we should care about and protect?
Absolutely. Yes,
that's incredibly perceptive. One famous pro-life thinker put it this way: every conversation about abortion comes down to the question of, what do you believe the unborn thing is? Because if the unborn child is not a human being, then you don't need to come up with a reason or an excuse, because that child really is just a part of your body, and we believe in bodily autonomy, and you may do with that as you wish. But if that unborn child is a human being, then there is no excuse, no explanation, no justification you can give that is ever going to be acceptable for putting that child to death. Ultimately, our disagreement is not about whether we have enough resources, whether we have too many people, or how we should distribute resources to people who are in need. Ultimately, our question is, what is the unborn child? Because nobody I have ever met supports solving the problem of overpopulation by random mass shootings, right? They only ever talk about it in the context of children that haven't been born yet. So you got to answer me the question of, what makes a child who hasn't been born yet less valuable than somebody who has already been born?
I have one final question for you, and that is, we've been ending our conversations with this question, for many weeks, and that is, how then can we, as Y for Life students, as a team, maybe at your school or maybe in your community or at your church, how can you take this message to the people you know? Remember, we kind of talked about how you might choose a service opportunity, education, worship, or celebration, those kind of 4 categories. Can you think of how this would fall into any of those categories?
The first thing that comes to my mind is service, and like food pantry, donations, all that lovely stuff, because if the problem with overpopulation is not enough resources, then naturally we need to be gathering resources to distribute to the people who don't have enough.
Good idea. Great idea. Other ideas? Could you do an educational event? Could you post facts, like a fact sheet? Did you know? We have service, we have still education, worship, and celebration. Can you use that in any other way? How many of you celebrate the birth, the births of other people? How many of you make a practice of celebrating new life? Yeah. Could you do that? Could you make it an activity, right? Something, in your school, if there's anybody who has a little brother or a little sister born, or a teacher that has a child, or how about, volunteering for a family that has lots of kids, to babysit. That would be another service opportunity. But again, to show that you support and encourage families. Pastor Duncan, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to comment in terms of that, serving those families that choose to have more than 2 children, as they are helping our country and the world repopulate itself. So Lutherans for Life has one small group, Lambs, Lutherans Assembling Mercy Blankets, and they give a free baby blanket to families that have 4 or more children. For people who are identified by anyone, they can put their name forward, and this group will make them a free blanket, send it to them with loving hands, celebrating that life. And that's the reason they do it, to celebrate those families who are choosing to have lots of life produced as a gift from God. And we could do the same thing, especially sometimes in church. As much as you don't like hearing it or seeing it, there are times when larger families are looked down upon. And we have the opportunity to affirm and positively express our joy that these families are growing and that they're large and that there's lots of children in their worship service or in that community.
Great. All right. So we are going to close for tonight. Our next Chats for Life is 2 weeks from now. Get the word out. Please invite your friends, and I'll see you in a couple weeks, okay?
Thanks for joining us for today's life topic. Check out whyforlife.org or email Michelle at whyforlife.org to find out how and when you can go live with us at our next Chats for Life session. Or join us next time, right here at Why for Life Podcasts, where youth learn how to be gospel-motivated voices for life.